We think integrity is about being consistent, staying true to your words, keeping your image intact. But Dietrich Bonhoeffer showed us something far more dangerous and far more sacred. Integrity is not about how others see you, it's about what you refuse to compromise when no one is watching and everyone is folding. In a time when Germany traded truth for safety, when even the church bent to the storm, Bonhoeffer didn't become louder, he became clearer. He didn't posture, he didn't brand himself, he aligned. That's what integrity truly is, alignment between your belief and your behavior, your conscience and your choices, your soul and your God. And that kind of integrity, it doesn't get applause, it gets misunderstood, silenced, even crucified. Bonhoeffer never aimed to be radical, he just refused to be false. And in a world where lies were rewarded, that refusal became a revolution. This is not a story about reputation. This is a guide for walking clean when the world turns dark. Not to survive, not to impress, but to stay whole when everything else fractures. That's what Bonhoeffer offers us now. Not advice, but a mirror. The question is not, will you be brave? It's, will you stay clean when it would be easier not to? Germany didn't fall overnight. It decayed by silence. One sermon softened, one lie tolerated, one pulpit shifted from Christ to country, and silence, the kind that looks like wisdom, became the safest choice in the world. The church didn't need to reject Jesus, it only needed to stop naming evil, to stay vague, to stay safe. And those who complied got to keep their buildings, their approval, their comfort. Bonhoeffer watched this unfold, not with outrage, but with grief, because he saw the cost. The gospel was being emptied, and in its place stood a religion of convenience, cloaked in patriotism and polished compromise. Most Christians said nothing, some justified it. Many called resistance unwise. But Bonhoeffer understood something most had forgotten. Silence is not neutral. It is a message. It tells the world what you're willing to ignore. He could have gone along, preached safer sermons, protected his future. Instead, he spoke, and when he did, they turned off the microphone. It was 1933. Germany had a new Führer. And Bonhoeffer had something to say. He stepped into the radio studio, not with fury, but with clarity sharpened by truth. A leader who allows himself to be worshipped, he said, is making himself an idol and leading the nation to ruin. He wasn't naming Hitler directly. He didn't need to. The room went still, the air electric. Then silence, mid-sentence. They cut the broadcast, not with rebuttal, not with debate, just a finger on the switch in the quiet roar of censorship. But that moment became something bigger, a metaphor for what would define the coming years. Speak truth and you vanish. Stay silent and you stay safe. Bonhoeffer wasn't shocked. He was confirmed. The system wouldn't oppose you outright. It would erase you quietly. No prison, no bullet, just a dial turned down. A voice made inconvenient. And he realized, if you wait for permission to speak, you've already agreed to silence. Bonhoeffer didn't become an enemy because he lied. He became one because he told the truth too early. The kind of truth that exposes complicity, that names what others would rather obscure, that refuses to wear the uniform of wisdom when wisdom means silence. As Hitler tightened his grip, Bonhoeffer tightened his alignment with Christ. And it made him dangerous, not because he was violent, but because he was clear. He said what others blurred, that Jesus, not the Führer, is Lord, that the church must speak when the state sins, that ethics cannot be rewritten by ideology, and clarity is costly when confusion is rewarded. Friends began to distance themselves. Colleagues warned him to tone it down. Even pastors urged him to wait for the right time. But Bonhoeffer knew there's never a safe time to tell dangerous truth. That's what makes it truth. He wasn't trying to be brave. He was trying to stay clean, because when truth becomes a liability, integrity becomes a risk. And Bonhoeffer accepted that risk not because he was fearless, but because he feared God more than men. By 1935, the collapse was visible. The German church had fractured, the truth had been softened, and compromise was dressed in religious robes. So Bonhoeffer didn't launch a protest. He built a seminary, Finkenwald, hidden, quiet, illegal. Not a place for popularity, a place for formation. Here, Bonhoeffer trained a new kind of pastor, not one fluent in performance, but one fluent in sacrifice. Their curriculum? Morning silence, shared psalms, confession without performance, community under pressure. "We are not forming preachers," he said. "We are forming men who can stand." Finkenwalde wasn't about intellectual pride. It was about integrity under duress. He wasn't raising voices. He was planting roots, because Bonhoeffer knew when the wind comes, only the anchored remain. And he didn't want men who could just quote theology. He wanted men who would carry it when the church was empty, the lights were off, and the only audience left was God. Bonhoeffer's greatest decisions were not made in the spotlight. They were made in the quiet, not with crowds cheering, but with his conscience whispering, "Obey here, again, even this." He didn't become courageous by accident. He became courageous by repetition, saying no to softened sermons, saying yes to losing influence, refusing to fudge the line for survival. He chose clarity when confusion was safer, chose stillness when noise got attention, chose loss when comfort was available. Each decision didn't seem revolutionary, but together they shaped a man who wouldn't bow when it finally mattered. We want to believe that integrity is one grand act, but it's not. It's a trail of ordinary refusals that lead you to a moment of extraordinary resolve. Bonhoeffer wasn't dramatic, he was consistent. He didn't wait for a crisis to decide who he was. His yes to God was pre-decided because he had said it 1,000 quiet times before. That's what integrity is, not a single moment of bravery, but a pattern, a soul that has practiced obedience until compromise becomes unthinkable. In 1939, Bonhoeffer stood on American soil, safe, respected, free. He could have stayed. He could have written books, spoken at conferences, led a movement from across the ocean. That's what his friends urged. You'll be more valuable alive, more useful at a distance. Even Reinhold Niebuhr, one of America's most revered theologians, pleaded with him to stay. But Bonhoeffer felt something deeper, a pull, not of fear, but of fidelity. "I have made a mistake in coming to America," he wrote. "I must live through this difficult time in our national history with the Christian people of Germany." That was it. No guarantees, no applause, no plan for success, just a return to the storm because that's where his conscience said he belonged. Strategy said, "You can do more good from here." Obedience said, "Go where it costs something." And Bonhoeffer knew real integrity doesn't ask, "Will this work?" It asks, "Is this aligned?" So he boarded the ship, returned home, and walked willingly into the shadows, not to win, but to obey. In dark times, not everyone bows, some adaptations. Some stay in the system, rationalizing it with clever language. We'll do more good from the inside. If we speak too clearly, we'll lose our influence. Better to compromise a little and live to preach another day. Bonhoeffer saw this happening everywhere. Pastors who once thundered truth now whispering slogans, theologians translating the gospel into whatever wouldn't offend the regime. It wasn't outright betrayal, it was strategic silence. And it worked, at least on paper. They kept their churches, their titles, their peace. But Bonhoeffer refused because he knew you can't preserve your position and your soul at the same time if the cost is clarity. He didn't judge those who stayed quiet. He just refused to join them. Not to speak is to speak, he had written. Not to act is to act. And for him, silence wasn't strategy. It was surrender. True integrity is not measured by how long you remain in the room, but by how long you remain aligned when the room starts to rot. It would have been easy to justify bending. Everyone else was doing it. Some preached half-truths. Others kept silent when lies were spoken in pulpits. Most just played along. Bonhoeffer didn't shout them down, he simply stayed clean. Clean in word, clean in conscience. Clean in surrender to Christ alone. He didn't believe you could preach one thing and excuse another in the name of survival. The church has only one weapon, he said, and that is the word of God, clearly spoken. And he knew, once your hands are stained with compromise, no eloquence can wash them. He lost invitations, he lost opportunities, he lost safety, but he kept the one thing that mattered, a soul not for sale. This wasn't moral perfection, it was relational obedience, staying faithful to the one who had called him, even when no one else did. Clean hands don't just mean innocence. They mean refusing to participate in what you know is wrong. And sometimes that refusal is the loudest sermon. Bonhoeffer didn't aim to be radical, he just didn't want to become fake. And in a world addicted to clever, he chose clean. Bonhoeffer didn't just write theology, he walked it. Every sentence in The Cost of Discipleship was carved from conviction, not theory, but fire. When Christ calls a man, he wrote, he bids him come and die. He didn't mean it metaphorically, he meant it literally, not just the moment of execution, but the 1,000 deaths before it. The death of comfort, the death of approval, the death of being understood. His books weren't polished arguments, they were invitations to crucifixion. Because for Bonhoeffer, there was no faith without obedience, and no obedience without sacrifice. Others talked about costly grace. He lived it. He chose the truth when it made him an enemy. He chose responsibility when it made him a target. He chose the cross when everyone else picked safety. He didn't just preach the gospel, he became a witness to it, and that's what integrity is. Not saying what's right, but living it. Even when it costs your future, your friends, your freedom, your breath. It's one thing to tell the truth. It's another to stay loving when those closest to you look away. Bonhoeffer watched friends step back. Pastors excuse the inexcusable. Mentors choose influence over integrity. And still, he didn't grow cold. He didn't turn prophetic clarity into personal disdain. He didn't burn bridges, he prayed for those who stayed silent. Wrote letters to those who misunderstood him. Even forgave those who would never apologize. That's the kind of integrity most people never talk about. We praise boldness, we admire courage, but the real fire lives in the man who holds love when it would be easier to let go. Judging others makes us blind, he wrote, whereas love is illuminating. He didn't just stand against evil, he stood for grace in the middle of betrayal. And that's the hardest thing, not just to stay clean in speech, but to stay soft in spirit when the people you love fail you. Bonhoeffer's integrity wasn't just theological, it was relational. And in a time when trust had collapsed, he refused to stop loving, even in chains, even in loneliness, even at the end. Bonhoeffer wasn't isolated because he was arrogant. He was isolated because he was aligned long before others were ready. He didn't rage. He didn't resent. He just walked further into obedience than others were willing to go. And the further he walked, the fewer followed. He warned early, spoke clearly, stayed consistent, and for it he was called rigid, overzealous, impractical. If we oppose too loudly, they said, we'll lose our influence. We'll ruin our ministry. It's not the right time. But Bonhoeffer had stopped asking, will this make sense to others? He had started asking, will this align with God? That's the test of integrity. Will you obey when no one else claps, when no one agrees, when no one follows? Because if you only obey when affirmed, you're not obedient. You're just popular. Bonhoeffer didn't choose loneliness, but when truth led him there, he didn't retreat. He just kept walking, clean, clear, obedient. By April 1945, the war was nearly over. But Bonhoeffer's time was not spared. He was moved to Flossenburg concentration camp. His writings were cut off, his name barely whispered, no crowd, no escape, no final sermon. But his integrity remained intact. The guards said he prayed with prisoners, that his peace unsettled them more than defiance ever could. He wasn't angry, he wasn't afraid, he was ready. He had walked so long in obedience that even the shadow of death did not break him. There, in the darkness, he held the light. He didn't rage against injustice, he bowed to the will of God. This is the end, for me, the beginning of life. Those were his final words before he was taken to the gallows. He didn't curse the silence, he sanctified it. Because Bonhoeffer knew, if your soul is aligned, they can cut off your voice, take your name, bury your body, but they cannot extinguish the truth you carried. That's why his legacy survived, because his obedience burned brighter than the empire that tried to crush it. Bonhoeffer didn't die fighting. He died surrendered, not surrendered to the regime, but to God. He wasn't dragged. He walked, calm, unshaken, fully aligned. No resistance left in his hands, because the fight was already won in the quiet choices made long before. He didn't try to escape. He didn't cry out. He didn't make his case, because Bonhoeffer's victory was never going to be visible. It was never about survival. It was about faithfulness. He once wrote, "Only he who believes is obedient, and only he who is obedient believes." He lived that sentence until the very end. No applause, no rescue, no final crowd. But in that stillness, in that final kneel, he became unforgettable, because he proved what no system could silence, that when integrity is complete, it doesn't need to win. It just needs to stay true, even to the gallows. We don't face Gestapo knocks, we face algorithmic silence. Shadow bans, platform warnings, corporate masks of tolerance that smother truth in the name of harmony. No one tells us to lie, they just reward us when we do. A softened post, a silence in the meeting, a moment where you let injustice pass to protect your paycheck. And it works. You keep your followers, your job, your peace, but your soul? That's the trade. Bonhoeffer's world was brutal, ours is subtle, but the outcome is the same. The erosion of clarity, the rewarding of compromise, the slow death of integrity. So what does it look like now? Refusing to echo what's popular when it betrays your conscience, loving without signaling, speaking when silence would protect you, saying no quietly, consistently, even when no one notices. That's where integrity lives now, in the tension, in the quiet, in the choice that costs even when it doesn't go viral. Bonhoeffer's guide still stands. Obey truth, even when truth makes you an exile, because alignment still matters, even in a world full of performance. Bonhoeffer wasn't famous when he died. He wasn't celebrated. He wasn't quoted. His books weren't bestsellers, his letters weren't shared, the world barely noticed, the church barely spoke. The silence was deafening. But history caught up to him, because truth waits and alignment echoes. Not because he tried to make a legacy, but because he refused to break his alignment. That's the paradox. The men who change the world are usually not the ones the world applauds while they're alive. Bonhoeffer didn't live for remembrance, he lived for obedience. And that's why we still remember him. Because the only legacy that lasts is the one forged in secret, upheld in storms and sealed with surrender, not claps, not statues, alignment. And in a time when everyone is fighting for recognition, Bonhoeffer quietly stands a man who never won but never bowed. We love stories like Bonhoeffer's until they turn on us. Because his life doesn't just inspire, it confronts. It asks not what you admire, but what you obey. Will you tell the truth when it costs your influence? Will you lose favor rather than say what they want to hear? Will you stay aligned when the reward for compromise is everything and the cost of obedience is silence? Will you choose integrity when no one will ever know you chose it? That's the real test, not performance, not passion, but quiet, consistent alignment when it's hard and lonely and invisible. Bonhoeffer didn't need the world's applause. He lived for a higher court. And so the question remains, when the pressure comes, will you stand clean? Not flawless, but surrendered, obedient, aligned, because in the end, your soul is the only stage that matters.